Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In this episode, we are going to continue our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And specifically, what I wanted to dedicate this episode to is the prospects that the Ukrainian military could be receiving the M1A1 or M1A2 variant main battle tank, the M1 Abrams. So this tank is very near and dear to my heart. I have had the opportunity to operate a M1A1 main battle tank and an M1A1 heavy common. Those are the tanks with the depleted uranium armor in the frontal turret. So the big question that I keep hearing in mainstream media about the shipping off of Abrams tanks to the Ukrainians is that it could take some time for the Ukrainians to learn to operate these tanks, and it could take the Ukrainians some time to learn to repair these tanks. And then a third element is the delivery time of these tanks from the United States or possibly Western Europe to the Ukrainians. So first, let's kind of dispel some of this conversation that we're hearing on just how much training the Ukrainians would need. So first, in the delivery of the tanks, the U.S. has thousands of these. So it's not like the U.S. is going to have to produce additional tanks. The U.S. could grab stockpiled tanks that are very much readily available in Western Europe or in the United States, put them on a ship, put them on a railhead, and send them to the Ukrainians. Now, the next piece of this is how much training would the Ukrainians need to operate, say, an M1A1 or an M1A2. I can't really go into depth about the M1A2, but I can tell you essentially what it would take and the training it would take to operate an M1A1. So let's start with the training of a U.S. tank crew. What does that look like? Well, when I was in the Army, the training of tanks was done at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and I understand that has since moved to another base, and it's more of a combined arms training that the U.S. military was doing. So in the U.S. Army, you have basically essentially two different types of training. You can join the Army, you go through your basic training, which is 8 to 10 weeks of basic training, and then you go off to your more advanced training if you're going through a more advanced type of military school. Now, the second type is they call it OSET. It's one station training, meaning you do basic training and you do your advanced training all at one site. And for armored crewmen, 19 kilo, that's the military occupational specialty for armored crewmen. That training lasts 14 to 16 weeks. And again, it's all one training, meaning your basic training and the training on your tank to become an armored crewman is done just at one locale. You don't go to basic training and then go to another area for tank training. It's all at one place, and it had been originally at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Again, different locale now. But again, 14 to 16 weeks, and essentially the first week that you're in the Army, you are then getting hands-on instruction on the M1 Abrams. Now, there's 4 crewmen in an M1 Abrams tank. You have a driver, you have a loader, a gunner, and a tank commander. The loader, the gunner, And the tank commander obviously sat in the turret. And the driver sits in the hall. I would say that you could train a relatively acceptable driver in about 3 days. So you could train a Ukrainian to drive an M1 Abrams in about 3 days. Not a problem. Especially if he's a current tanker. If he drives tracked vehicles, and again, well, not again, but the M1 Abrams is very simple to drive. It's simply a T-bar, like a motorcycle, and you have your accelerator right where your hand placement would be on the T-bar. And then you have a brake. And at the front of the T-bar, you basically have drive, reverse, and neutral. And that's pretty much it. And you press a button and you start the tank. And that's all there is to it. Now, there's more elements to being a driver, such as caring for the track, caring for the batteries, the power pack, checking the oil. And again, it's fairly rudimentary stuff that doesn't take a significant amount of training. Then the next position would be the loader, and I'm probably going from least difficulty to most difficulty. The next position would be the loader. Now that position is going to require that person to be a fairly strong individual. He's taking 120 millimeter rounds, and he's placing those rounds into the 120 millimeter Rheinmetall main gun of the Abrams. And ideally, you want to be able to load that round in about 4 seconds. Some are much faster, some are much slower. Again, it just depends on technique and then that person's strength. Then you have the gunner. And again, well, let me go back to the loader real quick. Again, not a extended period of time to train a person to be a loader on a main battle tank. And you're probably looking at, again, probably at most 3 days. And what I mean by 3 days, I'm talking 10, 12-hour days of learning the loader position. Not that difficult, really not. Now, a lot of the Ukrainian tanks that are being used have automatic loaders, so that's going to be something that's going to be new for them. As opposed to having an automatic loader, they would be manually loading the gun. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because those auto loaders, it requires a certain level of knowledge and understanding to correctly operate and maintain those auto loaders. Next is the gunner. So that is more or less in terms of the gunner is taking commands from the tank commander, and I would say it's a lot like a video game. You're looking through your optics downrange and you're searching for targets. And when you find those targets, you then engage that target with a certain type of ammunition. If you're going against if you're attacking a tank-like target, a T-72, T-90, based on my experience, you would load a sabot. If you were engaging a armored personnel carrier or armored infantry fighting vehicle, say a BMP-2, you would use high explosive anti-tank heat. You could also use the sabot as well. Not a problem. But generally speaking, it would probably take about a week, I would say, a week under war conditions to train maybe a Ukrainian tanker who has been a gunner on the Abrams. Now, the only difficult part that that could become an issue would just be bore sighting the tank. And that's a process that you can also get the assistance of something called a master gunner. In every company or battalion in the U.S. Army, there is a master gunner who is an expert at bore sighting the main gun. And that's very, very important. I'm not going to get into real technical depth here, but bore sighting is a process. It's something that has to be done prior to going into battle. You want to be able to shoot straight and hit your target. Bore sighting the gun does that. Next, finally, you have the tank commander. Now that could take a couple of weeks, 1 to 2 weeks, if that Ukrainian is currently a tank commander and say a T-64. A lot of the processes that you would use as a Ukrainian tank commander and a T-64, you would do the same thing in an M1 Abrams. Now, the tactics, obviously, a little bit different. U.S., at the time I was in, we would run a 4-tank platoon. The Ukrainians, the Russians, were utilizing, at the time I was in, a 3-tank platoon. A little bit different, but, again, not a lot of training to really learn how to operate an Abrams. So you could essentially, I would say, train an existing Ukrainian tank crew that maybe operated a T-64. Give them about 2 weeks of training, individualized training at each position, meaning the driver trains as the driver, the loader trains as the loader, the tank commander trains as the tank commander, the gunner. You would then have a tank crew in 2 weeks. Now, would they be the best tank crew on the planet? No, probably not, but that's going to come with experience. But the idea that this would be a multi-month process to train this Ukrainian tank crew, I think is a little bit unrealistic. I think they could do it a lot quicker. Now, to repair that tank, to have an issue where you have to pull the power pack and replace the power pack and do these other things, these mechanical things that are required on the tank, which isn't necessarily always done by the actual tank crew. We have, in the United States, you have tank repair, military occupational specialty. And these guys do the more advanced repairs of tanks. And I believe that could probably be done with subcontractors in Ukraine. But at the risk that obviously the Russians are going to hit those depots inside of the Ukraine. So if a Ukrainian M1 Abrams is hit or has some sort of catastrophic engine failure, what the Ukrainians would probably have to do is take the tank and send it back to Poland in a safe area to be repaired, and then transport it back into the Ukraine. That's probably what they would do until the Ukrainian system of being able to repair these tanks was fully up to speed. But it doesn't take a lot of training. It's not. I mean, it does. I mean, for in the U.S. military, obviously, it's a minimum of 14 to 16 weeks. But realistically, existing Ukrainian tankers could probably learn to operate these tanks very quickly. They're pretty intuitive, and it's not something that is overly advanced. Obviously, I would say dropping the breech block on a 120 millimeter Rheinmetall is something that is definitely learned and takes usually 2 people to do that. You know, the headspace and timing on a Maul Deuce, a little different. You can learn that in a day or 2. But yeah, again, I just don't see how it would be that difficult to train these Ukrainian tankers if, in fact, the United States really wants to send these M1 Abrams over to Ukraine. And I have a hunch the Biden administration really doesn't want to send these tanks. And I would doubt that the U.S. would send the newer A2s with depleted uranium in the turret, out of risk the Russians capturing one of those tanks. And I mean, to this day, that armor is fairly classified. And yes, the frontal aspect of the Abrams is a very, very well armored vehicle, very well armored. But more importantly, the 120 millimeter German Rheinmetall main gun, the 120 millimeter smooth bore, especially if it's firing depleted uranium rounds, sabos, that is a beast. And some of these engagement ranges that I've seen in Ukraine, you're probably looking at between fields. If we look, you can kind of see you have what is forested areas, and then you have open fields in between some of these areas. And if you measure the distance, right, between these forested, bushy areas to the full expanse of the field, and you're looking at 2.7 kilometers. Some are more closer than others. Like, let's see here, this area here. You know, tank on tank duel, 927 meters. So I don't know a vehicle that currently exists, if it were hit, even a frontal aspect shot, even an Abrams, hit at 900 meters with a 120 millimeter depleted uranium sabot, is going to come out okay. That round does something while it's in flight. It flies at a tremendous velocity, and then when that depleted uranium hits metal on metal at that velocity, I'm just going to say something happens. And it's not good for the crew of the opposing tank. And I can say without a doubt that the Abrams, the Leo 2, are much more accurate at hitting targets than, say, a T-90 or a T-72. I've seen quite a bit of Russian tank training where they are either underlining or overlining their first and second shots. They're missing targets. And I don't know if that's the bore sighting of the tank. I don't know if that's the training of the gunner. I don't know if that's the quality of the ammunition or the wear and tear that's happening with the 125 millimeter gun on the T-72B3 and T-80s and T-90s. But I do know the Abrams hits incredibly accurately. And you can move, you can shoot. Obviously, the Russian tank can do that too, but not as accurate. But the big thing with the Abrams is its weight, and it's the amount of armor that's on that vehicle combined with the 120 millimeter Rheinmetall. It is a very heavy, very well armored machine. I mean, look, a T-72, 40 tons, 50 tons at best. You're looking at close to 70 tons, 68 tons. So a lot more armor that's on that vehicle, especially if you're engaging the frontal aspect, either the hull or the turret. So again, you know, the idea that it would take this extensive period of time for the Ukrainians to get these machines and learn to operate these machines, I think is probably a stretch at this point. And it's probably because the U.S. doesn't really want to give those systems to the Ukrainians at this point. And there's a variety, again, there's a variety of reasons for that. So just wanted to do a video on that, talk about that, and I think I've done a fairly good job at that. Thank you for joining us today. More to come soon. Have a good day.